The smell of kettle corn and cotton candy still haunted Margaret Chen 15 years later. Every September, when the autumn air carried that distinctive sweetness through her kitchen window in Cedar Falls, Iowa, she would freeze mid-motion, whether washing dishes, folding laundry, or preparing dinner, and for a moment she was back at the Black Hawk County Fair on that devastating night in 2009. It was supposed to be a perfect family evening. 8-year-old Emma had been begging for weeks to go to the county fair, her dark eyes lighting up every time she saw the colorful advertisements plastered around their small town. "Please, Mom, please. Jenny's family is going, and Tommy from school said they have a Ferris wheel this year that's even bigger than last time." Margaret remembered how her husband, David, had smiled at their daughter's enthusiasm. "All right, Princess, but you have to finish your vegetables first," he had said, pointing to the untouched broccoli on Emma's plate. The little girl had attacked those green trees with such determination that Margaret had laughed, the last genuine laugh she would have for months to come. The Black Hawk County Fair had been a Cedar Falls tradition for over 60 years. Held annually on the sprawling fairgrounds just outside town, it attracted families from across eastern Iowa. Local farmers displayed their prize-winning livestock, teenagers showed off restored tractors, and carnival rides operated by traveling crews brought excitement to the otherwise quiet agricultural community. On September 12, 2009, the Chen family arrived at the fairgrounds at exactly 6:30 p.m. David had insisted on the early arrival because parking became impossible after 7 o'clock, and Emma had pressed her face against the car window the entire drive, practically vibrating with anticipation. "Look, there's the tilt-a-whirl and the ring toss game where you can win stuffed animals." Emma had pointed to each attraction as if she were a tour guide, though this was only her second time at the county fair. The previous year, she had been too scared to ride anything except the carousel. But now, at 8, she considered herself brave enough for the bigger adventures. Margaret still remembered what Emma was wearing that night with painful clarity. A bright yellow sundress with tiny sunflowers printed across the fabric, white sandals that sparkled with small rhinestones, and her hair pulled back in 2 neat pigtails secured with matching yellow ribbons. She had insisted on wearing her new butterfly necklace, a birthday gift from her grandmother, because it makes me look more grown up. The fair was bustling with the usual crowd of families, teenagers on dates, and elderly couples enjoying the mild September evening. Strings of colorful lights illuminated the midway, and the sounds of carnival games, children's laughter, and classic rock music from the rides created the familiar symphony of small-town celebration. David bought a roll of tickets at the entrance booth, and Emma clutched them like precious treasure. "Can we ride the bumper cars first, Dad? Please?" Her excitement was infectious, and even Margaret, who typically worried about carnival ride safety, found herself smiling at her daughter's joy. The family spent the next 2 hours moving from attraction to attraction. Emma conquered her fear of the scrambler, squealing with delight as the ride spun her around. She tried her hand at the ring toss game, missing every bottle, but receiving a small consolation prize from the sympathetic booth operator. David won her a stuffed pink elephant at the basketball shooting game, and Emma hugged it tightly, declaring it would sleep in her bed forever. As the evening progressed, the crowds grew thicker. Teenagers began arriving in larger groups, their voices louder and their energy more intense than the earlier family atmosphere. Margaret noticed David checking his watch more frequently. It was approaching 8:30 p.m., and they had planned to leave by 9 o'clock since Emma had school the next day. "One more ride," Emma pleaded, her eyes focused on the Ferris wheel that dominated the fairground's skyline. Its colorful lights moved in mesmerizing patterns against the darkening sky, and Margaret could understand her daughter's fascination. "All right," David agreed. "But after the Ferris wheel, we head home. Deal?" "Deal," Emma had practically skipped toward the ride, still clutching her pink elephant. The line for the Ferris wheel was longer than expected, snaking around barriers set up to manage the crowd. Margaret estimated about a 20-minute wait, which would put them leaving the fair around 9:15 p.m. Later than planned, but still reasonable for a school night. As they waited in line, Emma chatted excitedly about her favorite parts of the evening and made plans for next year's fair. "Maybe I'll be brave enough for the haunted house by then," she mused. "Or maybe the spinning ride that goes really high in the air." Margaret and David stood behind their daughter, David's hand resting protectively on Emma's shoulder as the line slowly moved forward. Other families surrounded them, the Johnsons from their neighborhood, the Martinez family from Emma's class at school, and various other Cedar Falls residents they recognized but didn't know personally. At approximately 8:45 p.m., they were third in line for the Ferris wheel. Emma was practically bouncing on her toes with anticipation, holding her stuffed elephant and pointing out details about the ride to her parents. "Look how high it goes, Mom. We'll be able to see our whole house from up there." That's when Margaret noticed a commotion near the game booths about 50 feet away. A crowd was gathering around something, and she could hear raised voices, though not clearly enough to understand the words. David noticed her distraction and followed her gaze. "Looks like someone won the big prize," he said dismissively, turning his attention back to Emma, who was now second in line. But the voices were getting louder, and Margaret felt an inexplicable sense of unease. The crowd near the game booths was growing, and she could see people pointing and gesturing animatedly. Some appeared to be arguing. "David," she began, but her words were cut off by Emma's excited squeal. "We're next! We're next!" Emma was practically dancing as the current Ferris wheel passengers began to disembark. Margaret tried to shake off her worry. This was a family fun evening, and she was probably overreacting to what was likely just an excited celebration or minor disagreement. These things happened at crowded events. The Ferris wheel operator, a young man with multiple tattoos and a friendly smile, gestured for the next group to board. "Come on up, folks! Beautiful night for a ride!" Emma started forward eagerly, but David put out his arm to stop her. "Hold on, Princess. Mom and Dad go first, then you." It was a safety precaution they always followed. Adults board first to ensure Emma was secure. As Margaret and David stepped into the Ferris wheel car, Margaret glanced back toward the game booths. The crowd had grown even larger, and now she could see someone in uniform, possibly fair security or maybe a police officer, pushing through the gathering people. "Emma, come on, sweetheart," David called to their daughter, who was still standing at the boarding area, clutching her pink elephant and staring at the same commotion that had caught Margaret's attention. "What's happening over there?" Emma asked, her 8-year-old curiosity overriding her excitement about the ride. "Nothing that concerns us," Margaret said firmly. "Come get in the car, honey. We want to see the view before it gets too dark." Emma took a step toward the Ferris wheel car, then stopped again. "Mom, is someone in trouble?" Margaret was about to answer when the commotion suddenly escalated. She could hear someone shouting, "Call the police! Call the police!" And the crowd began to scatter in different directions. Some people were running toward the disturbance, while others were clearly trying to get away from it. The Ferris wheel operator looked toward the commotion with concern, then back at his passengers. "Folks, we might need to hold up for just a minute while they sort out whatever's going on over there." David started to get out of the Ferris wheel car. "Maybe we should see what's happening," he said to Margaret. "If someone's hurt or there's some kind of emergency." That decision would haunt the Chen family forever. "Emma, stay right here by the ride," Margaret instructed firmly as she and David stepped out of the Ferris wheel car. "Don't move from this spot. Do you understand? Hold onto the railing and wait for us." "But I want to see what's happening too," Emma protested. "No," David's voice was stern but not unkind. You stay right here. We'll be back in just a minute, and then we'll take our ride." Emma nodded reluctantly, positioning herself against the Ferris wheel's safety railing and hugging her pink elephant tighter. Margaret took one last look at her daughter, standing there in her yellow sundress, pigtails slightly mussed from the evening's activities, butterfly necklace glinting under the carnival lights, and then followed David toward the disturbance. The crowd around the game booths was chaotic. Apparently, there had been an altercation between two groups of teenagers, and one young man had been injured. Fair security was trying to manage the situation while someone called for medical assistance. Margaret and David found themselves swept up in the confusion, pushed further into the crowd by other concerned onlookers trying to see what was happening. "We shouldn't have left Emma," Margaret said to David, raising her voice to be heard over the noise. "She's fine," David replied, though he was already turning to head back toward the Ferris wheel. "She's a smart kid. She knows to stay put." But when they pushed their way back through the crowd and reached the Ferris wheel, Emma was gone. The ride operator was dealing with other passengers and didn't immediately notice their return. Margaret's eyes frantically scanned the immediate area. Maybe Emma had just stepped to the side, or moved to get a better view, or gone to the bathroom. "Emma!" Margaret called out, her voice starting to carry the edge of panic. "Emma, where are you?" David began searching the immediate vicinity, checking behind the ride barriers, looking toward the nearby food stands, calling their daughter's name with increasing urgency. "Excuse me," Margaret approached the Ferris wheel operator. "Did you see where the little girl in the yellow dress went, the one who was waiting to ride with us?" The operator looked confused. "The little Asian girl with the pigtails? I thought she was with you folks." "She was supposed to wait right here," David said, his voice tight with concern. "We told her not to move." "I don't know, man," the operator said, looking genuinely worried now. "I was watching the situation over there with the fight, and then when I looked back, I figured she'd gone with you." Margaret felt the first real stab of terror. Emma was a obedient child. She wouldn't have wandered off without permission, especially when they had specifically told her to wait. Something was wrong. For the next 30 minutes, Margaret and David searched the fairgrounds systematically. They checked every game booth, every food stand, every ride line. They enlisted the help of other families they knew, and fair security joined the search. Emma's description was announced over the fair's public address system. 8-year-old girl, yellow sundress, dark hair in pigtails, carrying a pink stuffed elephant. By 9:45 p.m., the Cedar Falls Police Department had been called. Detective Ray Morrison arrived at 10:15 p.m., a 25-year veteran of the force who had handled missing children cases before. He was a tall, methodical man with graying hair and kind eyes, and he immediately took charge of the search efforts. "I need you to tell me exactly what happened," Detective Morrison said to Margaret and David, leading them to a quiet area away from the ongoing search. "Start from when you arrived at the fair." Margaret recounted the evening in detail, her voice becoming more strained with each word. David filled in details she missed, and together they painted a picture of what had seemed like a perfect family night that had turned into their worst nightmare. "You said Emma was specifically told to wait by the Ferris wheel," Detective Morrison noted. "In your opinion, would she normally follow that instruction?" "Always," Margaret said without hesitation. She's a very obedient child. She doesn't wander off. If we tell her to stay somewhere, she stays there." "What about strangers?" the detective asked. "Had you talked to her about not going with people she doesn't know?" "Of course," David replied. "We've had that conversation many times. Emma knows about stranger danger. She wouldn't go with someone she didn't know." Detective Morrison nodded, making notes. "What was she carrying with her? You mentioned a stuffed elephant." "A pink elephant that David won for her at the basketball game," Margaret said, "and she was wearing a butterfly necklace, a gift from her grandmother." She never takes it off. By midnight, the search had expanded beyond the fairgrounds. Police officers were interviewing everyone who had been at the fair that evening, particularly those who had been near the Ferris wheel around the time of Emma's disappearance. Fair employees were questioned extensively, and background checks were run on all carnival workers. The investigation revealed disturbing possibilities. The carnival that provided the rides was a traveling operation that moved from town to town throughout the Midwest. Many of the workers were transient, with limited background information available. Some had criminal records, though nothing that would have prevented them from working at a county fair. Moreover, the timing of Emma's disappearance during the altercation at the game booths seemed too convenient to be coincidental. Someone could have deliberately created the distraction to draw attention away from their actions near the Ferris wheel. The media attention began almost immediately. Cedar Falls was a small town where everyone knew everyone, and the disappearance of 8-year-old Emma Chen became front-page news in the regional papers and the lead story on local television stations. The image of Emma in her yellow sundress, smiling brightly in her most recent school photo, became heartbreakingly familiar to residents throughout eastern Iowa. Search parties organized by volunteers combed through cornfields, wooded areas, and abandoned buildings throughout Black Hawk County. The FBI was called in to assist with the investigation, bringing additional resources and expertise to what was now being treated as a potential kidnapping case. Margaret and David's world had collapsed in the span of 30 minutes. One moment they were a happy family enjoying a night at the county fair, and the next they were living every parent's worst nightmare, frantically searching for their missing child, while police asked increasingly difficult questions about their family life, their relationships, and any possible reasons someone might want to harm Emma. The investigation expanded rapidly. Police discovered that several other children had gone missing from county fairs across the Midwest over the past 5 years, though none from the same traveling carnival company. The pattern was disturbing, but not conclusive. Child disappearances at large public events weren't uncommon, and often involved family custody disputes or runaways rather than stranger abductions. Emma's case was different, though. She was only 8 years old, with no history of behavioral problems or family conflicts that might explain running away. Her parents had no custody disputes, no bitter divorces, no angry relatives who might have taken her. The Chen family was, by all accounts, stable and loving. As the hours turned into days and the days into weeks, the investigation began to follow familiar patterns that Margaret and David learned to dread. Initial leads would generate excitement and hope, only to dead-end in disappointment. Witnesses thought they had seen Emma at a truck stop in Nebraska, but it turned out to be another child. A carnival worker with a suspicious background was questioned extensively, but his alibi checked out. Phone calls from psychics and well-meaning citizens poured in, each one investigated thoroughly, each one leading nowhere. The hardest part was the waiting. Margaret found herself unable to leave the house for fear that Emma would somehow find her way home and no one would be there. David threw himself into the search efforts, driving to every town where the carnival stopped, posting flyers, interviewing anyone who would talk to him. Their marriage, strong as it had been, began to strain under the impossible weight of grief and uncertainty. Margaret blamed herself for agreeing to leave Emma alone at the Ferris wheel. David blamed himself for suggesting they investigate the commotion. Both blamed themselves for not holding on to their daughter more tightly, for not anticipating the unthinkable. The community rallied around the Chen family with remarkable support. Neighbors brought meals, friends organized additional search parties, and the local church held prayer vigils. But nothing could fill the Emma-shaped hole in their lives. And as the weeks turned into months, some people began to stop asking about the investigation, assuming that if there was news, they would hear it. Detective Morrison never gave up, though his active caseload meant that Emma's disappearance couldn't receive his full attention indefinitely. He kept the case file open and followed up on leads as they came in, but after 6 months without significant progress, the investigation settled into a holding pattern. "We haven't forgotten about Emma," Detective Morrison assured Margaret and David during one of their regular meetings. "This case will never be closed until we have answers. But I have to be honest with you. Without new evidence or witnesses, we're limited in what we can actively pursue." The first anniversary of Emma's disappearance was devastating. Margaret had hoped that the renewed media attention might generate new leads, but the coverage was brief and yielded nothing substantial. The second anniversary passed more quietly, and by the third, the local media had moved on to other stories. Margaret and David tried to rebuild their lives, but it felt like an impossible task. How do you move forward when part of your heart is missing? How do you make future plans when the most important person in your world might walk through the door at any moment or might never come home at all? They went to grief counseling, both together and separately. Margaret learned coping strategies for dealing with the guilt and uncertainty, while David struggled with his need to take action in a situation where no effective action seemed possible. Some days were better than others, but the pain never fully subsided. As the years passed, Margaret developed a routine that helped her maintain some sense of hope. Every morning, she would check her email for any messages from Detective Morrison or the FBI. She monitored missing children databases and social media groups dedicated to finding lost kids. She kept Emma's room exactly as it had been the night of the disappearance, changing the sheets regularly and dusting the furniture as if her daughter might return at any moment. David channeled his energy into advocacy work, connecting with other families of missing children and supporting legislation to improve Amber Alert systems and missing child investigations. It gave him a sense of purpose and a way to honor Emma's memory, even while they still held on to hope that she was alive somewhere. The hardest moments came unexpectedly. Margaret would see a girl with dark hair and pigtails at the grocery store and feel her heart stop for a moment. David would hear a child's laughter that reminded him of Emma's distinctive giggle and have to step away to collect himself. Birthdays and holidays became endurance tests rather than celebrations. By 2019, 10 years after Emma's disappearance, Margaret and David had learned to live with the uncertainty, though they had never learned to accept it. They had moved to a smaller house in the same neighborhood, unable to bear living in the home where Emma's empty bedroom served as a constant reminder of their loss. Detective Morrison had retired, but he had passed Emma's case to Detective Sarah Williams, a younger officer who brought fresh eyes to the investigation. Detective Williams had reviewed all the case files and conducted several new interviews, but the trail had grown cold over the years. "I know this is incredibly difficult," Detective Williams had told them during their first meeting, "but I want you to know that I'm committed to finding answers about Emma. Technology has improved significantly since 2009, and we have resources now that weren't available then." The technological advances were encouraging. DNA analysis had become more sophisticated. Facial recognition software could analyze images more effectively, and social media provided new ways to distribute information about missing children. But Emma had vanished in an era before smartphones were ubiquitous, so there was limited photographic evidence from the night of her disappearance. Still, Margaret maintained her morning routine of checking for updates, and David continued his advocacy work. They had learned to live with the uncertainty, but they had never stopped believing that someday, somehow, they would find out what happened to their daughter. Neither of them could have imagined that the answer would come in the form of a billboard in New York City, or that it would raise more questions than it answered. By 2015, 6 years after Emma's disappearance, Margaret Chen had developed what she called her Tuesday ritual. Every Tuesday morning at exactly 9 a.m., she would sit at her kitchen table with a cup of coffee and systematically check every missing children database, social media group, and law enforcement website she could access. It had become a form of meditation for her, a way to feel like she was actively searching for her daughter even when there was nothing concrete to search for. The ritual had evolved over the years. Initially, Margaret had checked these resources daily, sometimes multiple times per day, refreshing pages obsessively and following every possible lead, no matter how remote. But the emotional toll had been devastating, and her therapist, Dr. Patricia Henley, had helped her establish boundaries that allowed her to maintain hope without destroying her mental health. "You can't save Emma by destroying yourself," Dr. Henley had said during one of their sessions in 2012. "If she comes home, when she comes home, she's going to need a mother who is emotionally and physically capable of helping her heal." The phrase, "when she comes home," had become Margaret's mantra. Not if, but when. It was a small distinction that carried enormous emotional weight. The difference between hope and despair. On this particular Tuesday in March 2015, Margaret was following her usual routine when she noticed something different in one of the Facebook groups dedicated to missing children. Someone had posted about advances in age progression technology, specifically mentioning that the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children had updated their computer modeling systems. Age progression images had always been both a source of comfort and agony for Margaret and David. Every few years, experts would create new digital renderings of what Emma might look like as she grew older. The first one, created when she would have been 10 years old, had been almost unbearable to see. It was clearly Emma, but older, changed, a reminder of all the birthdays and milestones they had missed. Margaret immediately called Detective Williams to inquire about having new age progression images created of Emma at 16 years old. The detective was supportive and promised to make the arrangements, but she also felt obligated to prepare Margaret for the emotional impact. "These images can be difficult to see," Detective Williams warned. "They're based on statistical probability and family genetics, but they're not photographs. I don't want you to be disappointed if the images don't look exactly like you expect." When the new age progression images arrived 2 weeks later, Margaret stared at them for hours. The computer-generated Emma at 16 was beautiful. Long dark hair, confident eyes, a smile that reminded Margaret of her own mother. But it was also a stranger, a young woman Margaret had never met, representing 6 years of growth and change that had happened somewhere beyond her reach. David's reaction was different. He studied the images analytically, as if they were evidence in an investigation rather than artistic representations of their missing daughter. "She would be a junior in high school now," he said quietly, sitting beside Margaret at their kitchen table. "She'd probably be thinking about college, maybe learning to drive." These conversations about Emma's parallel life, the one she would have been living if she had never disappeared, were among the most painful aspects of their ongoing grief. Margaret often found herself imagining Emma's 16th birthday party, wondering what subjects she would excel at in school, picturing her bringing a boyfriend home to meet her parents. Detective Williams distributed the new age progression images through all available channels: law enforcement databases, missing children organizations, social media platforms, and local news outlets. The response was immediate, with dozens of tips coming in from people who thought they had seen someone matching the updated images. Most of the tips led nowhere, as was typical with missing children cases. Well-meaning citizens would spot teenagers who bore a superficial resemblance to the age progression images and contact authorities, but follow-up investigations invariably revealed that the sightings were of other children with no connection to Emma Chen. However, one tip from this round of publicity would prove significant, though not in the way anyone expected. A woman named Carol Stevens from Dubuque, Iowa, called Detective Williams to report that she thought she had seen someone matching Emma's description at a shopping mall in Chicago during a family vacation the previous summer. Carol was hesitant to call, she explained, because the sighting had been months earlier and she wasn't entirely certain of what she had seen. "I probably wouldn't have called," Carol told Detective Williams, "but when I saw the new pictures in the newspaper, something clicked. There was this girl at the mall, probably 15 or 16, with an older woman who didn't seem like her mother. The girl looked, I don't know how to describe it, but she looked like she didn't belong with the woman she was with." Detective Williams had heard similar reports countless times over the years, but she dutifully took down all the details. Carol described seeing the girl and woman at the Woodfield Mall in Schaumburg, Illinois, near Chicago, sometime in July 2014. The girl had been wearing casual clothes and appeared healthy and well cared for. But something about the interaction between her and the older woman had struck Carol as odd. "The woman was very controlling," Carol explained. "She kept a tight grip on the girl's arm, and when the girl tried to look at things in store windows, the woman would pull her along. It seemed strange for a mother and teenage daughter." Detective Williams forwarded Carol's information to law enforcement in Illinois, knowing that the chances of tracking down a random girl and woman at a busy shopping mall based on a months-old sighting were virtually non-existent, but every lead had to be followed, no matter how remote the possibility of success. The Illinois investigators were thorough, but ultimately unable to develop any concrete information from Carol's report. Shopping mall security footage from July 2014 had long since been deleted, and without more specific details about timing or location within the mall, there was little they could do beyond circulating Emma's information among local officers. This pattern of promising leads that ultimately led nowhere had become depressingly familiar to the Chen family. Over the years, there had been dozens of similar reports. Emma spotted at a bus station in Denver, living with a family in rural Wisconsin, working at a restaurant in Florida. Each report generated a surge of hope, followed by inevitable disappointment when follow-up investigations proved fruitless. The emotional roller coaster was exhausting, but Margaret and David had learned that they couldn't allow themselves to become cynical about tips from the public. Somewhere among all the false leads and mistaken identities, there might be the one crucial piece of information that would bring Emma home. Meanwhile, David had become increasingly involved in advocating for legislative changes to improve missing children investigations. He had connected with other families facing similar situations, and together they had formed a support network that lobbied for better resources, improved coordination between law enforcement agencies, and enhanced public awareness about child abduction. "The first 48 hours are crucial," David would tell legislators during his advocacy presentations. "But after that, families need sustained support and investigation. A case can't be allowed to go cold just because there are no immediate leads." David's advocacy work had brought him into contact with families whose children had been missing for decades, as well as families who had eventually been reunited with their children after years of separation. The reunion stories provided hope, but they also highlighted how dramatically children could change during extended absences from their families. One case that particularly affected David involved a girl named Jessica Martinez, who had been abducted at age 7 and found 12 years later, living under a different name in another state. When Jessica was eventually reunited with her biological family, she had no memory of her early childhood and had to rebuild relationships with parents who were essentially strangers to her. "The happy ending isn't just finding your child," Jessica's father had told David during one of their conversations. "It's helping them heal from whatever they've experienced and learning to be a family again after years of separation." This perspective helped David and Margaret prepare mentally for the possibility that if Emma was found, their reunion might be complicated by years of separation and potentially traumatic experiences. They had consulted with therapists who specialized in reunification after child abduction, learning about the psychological challenges that both missing children and their families faced when attempting to rebuild their relationships. Dr. Henley had been particularly helpful in preparing them for various scenarios. "If Emma is found, she may not remember you clearly," she had explained. "She may have formed attachments to the people who took her, especially if she was young when it happened. Your job won't be to expect her to immediately return to being the 8-year-old who disappeared, but to help the person she has become feel safe and loved." These conversations were both heartbreaking and necessary. Margaret struggled with the idea that Emma might not remember her clearly, or that she might have been raised to believe her kidnappers were her real family. But she also knew that preparing for these possibilities was essential for everyone's emotional well-being. By 2018, nearly 10 years after Emma's disappearance, Margaret and David had settled into what they privately called their new normal. They had learned to live with uncertainty while maintaining hope, to plan for the future while remaining ready to drop everything if Emma was found. Margaret had returned to work part-time as a librarian, finding comfort in the quiet routine of organizing information and helping people find what they were looking for. David had expanded his advocacy work and was now serving on the board of directors for a national missing children organization. Their marriage had survived the devastating stress of Emma's disappearance, though it had required conscious effort and professional help. They had learned to communicate about their grief without competing over who was suffering more, and they had developed strategies for supporting each other through particularly difficult days. "We're different people than we were before," Margaret had told Dr. Henley during one of their sessions, "but we're still a team, and we still love each other. Emma would want us to take care of each other." The 10th anniversary of Emma's disappearance in 2019 had been especially challenging. The local media coverage was more extensive than it had been in recent years, and the renewed attention generated several new tips, though none proved credible upon investigation. Detective Williams had organized a press conference to mark the anniversary, appealing to the public for any information about Emma's case and highlighting the rewards that were still available for information leading to her recovery. Margaret and David participated in the press conference, something they had learned to do despite their natural desire for privacy. "Emma would be 18 now," Margaret had said into the television cameras, her voice steady despite the emotions churning beneath the surface. "If she's watching this, we want her to know that we have never stopped looking for her, and we never will. Our door is always open, and our love for her has only grown stronger over the years." The press conference generated national attention, with Emma's story being featured on several crime television shows and true crime podcasts. The exposure resulted in hundreds of new tips, though Detective Williams warned Margaret and David not to expect immediate results. "National attention is a double-edged sword," the detective explained. "It generates a lot of leads, but most of them won't be credible. We'll investigate everything thoroughly, but I want you to be prepared for the process to take time." The investigation of tips from the national media attention took several months and yielded no significant breakthroughs. However, one of the crime television shows that featured Emma's case caught the attention of a private investigator named Marcus Thompson, who specialized in missing children cases. Marcus contacted Detective Williams to offer his services pro bono, explaining that he had followed Emma's case over the years and believed that new investigative approaches might yield results. He had access to databases and analytical tools that weren't available to most law enforcement agencies, and he was willing to dedicate significant time to Emma's case. "I've been doing this for 20 years, Marcus explained to Margaret and David during their first meeting. I don't take on cases unless I believe there's a reasonable chance of developing new information. Something about Emma's disappearance has always bothered me, and I think there are investigative avenues that haven't been fully explored. Marcus's approach was systematic and thorough. He began by reviewing every piece of evidence from the original investigation, interviewing witnesses who hadn't been contacted in years and applying new analytical techniques to old information. One area Marcus focused on was the carnival workers who had been at the Black Hawk County Fair the night Emma disappeared. The original investigation had been hampered by the transient nature of carnival employment, but Marcus had access to more sophisticated databases that could track employment histories and criminal records across multiple states. Carnival workers move around a lot, Marcus explained, but they don't disappear completely. They have social security numbers, driver's licenses, sometimes criminal records. With modern database technology, we can build a much more complete picture of who was at that fair and where they went afterward. Dunedin, Marcus's investigation revealed several carnival workers who had left the traveling show shortly after the Black Hawk County Fair. Though this wasn't necessarily suspicious, carnival employment was notoriously unstable, and workers frequently moved between different companies or left the business entirely. However, one former carnival worker named Thomas Brennan had caught Marcus's attention. Brennan had worked as a ride operator for the company that provided the Ferris wheel where Emma was last seen. He had left the carnival business immediately after the Iowa Fair and had moved to New York State, where he had since lived under several different names. Brennan has a history of minor criminal activity, Marcus reported to Detective Williams and the Chen family. Nothing directly related to children, but he's been arrested multiple times for fraud and identity theft. More importantly, he seems to have deliberately obscured his trail after leaving Iowa. Detective Williams was intrigued by Marcus's findings, but cautioned against jumping to conclusions. We need to be careful not to focus too narrowly on one suspect without evidence, she warned, but this definitely warrants further investigation. The investigation into Thomas Brennan proved challenging. He had indeed used multiple aliases over the years, and tracking his movements and activities required cooperation from law enforcement agencies in several states. However, when investigators finally located him in Albany, New York, in late 2020, they discovered that he had died of a drug overdose 6 months earlier. Brennan's death was another dead end, but Marcus's investigation had demonstrated the value of applying new technology and fresh perspective to old cases. Even though the Brennan lead hadn't panned out, the process had generated new information and investigative approaches that might prove valuable in the future. This is how these cases get solved, Marcus explained to Margaret and David. Not usually through dramatic breakthroughs, but through patient, systematic investigation that gradually builds a more complete picture of what happened. By 2021, 12 years after Emma's disappearance, the case had settled into a new phase. Detective Williams continued to follow up on occasional tips. Marcus Thompson maintained his private investigation on a part-time basis, and Margaret and David had learned to balance hope with acceptance of their ongoing uncertainty. The COVID-19 pandemic had added new challenges to the investigation, as travel restrictions and social distancing requirements made traditional investigative techniques more difficult. However, the pandemic had also accelerated the adoption of digital investigation tools, and law enforcement agencies had developed new ways to share information and coordinate investigations remotely. Margaret had used the pandemic lockdown period to digitize and organize all the physical documents related to Emma's case: police reports, newspaper clippings, photographs, and correspondence with investigators. The process had been emotionally difficult but practically valuable, creating a comprehensive digital archive that could be easily shared with investigators or media outlets. David had continued his advocacy work, Though much of it had moved online during the pandemic, he had participated in virtual conferences and webinars about missing children cases, sharing the Chen family's experience and continuing to push for legislative improvements. As 2022 began, 13 years after Emma's disappearance, Margaret and David were facing new challenges in maintaining their emotional equilibrium. They were now in their 50s, and the constant stress of uncertainty had taken a physical toll on both of them. Margaret had developed chronic insomnia, and David had been diagnosed with high blood pressure that his doctor attributed partly to stress. "We have to find ways to take care of ourselves," Dr. Henley had reminded them during a therapy session. "You can't help Emma if you don't survive long enough to be reunited with her." The advice was practical, but difficult to implement. How do you relax and enjoy life when your child is missing? How do you plan for retirement when you might need to drop everything to travel to wherever your daughter has been found? These questions became even more complicated in early 2023, when Detective Williams announced that she was retiring and Emma's case would be transferred to a new detective. Detective Williams had been a constant presence in their lives for nearly 4 years, and the prospect of starting over with someone new was daunting. "I'm not abandoning the case," Detective Williams assured them during her final meeting as Emma's primary investigator. "Detective Rodriguez is an excellent investigator, and I'll make sure he has all the background information and understands the nuances of Emma's case. You're in good hands." Detective Carlos Rodriguez was indeed competent and compassionate, but the transition was still difficult for Margaret and David. They had to retell Emma's story once again, explain the significance of various investigative approaches, and build trust with another law enforcement professional. By late 2023, 14 years after Emma's disappearance, the case had reached a point that Margaret and David had never quite imagined when their daughter first went missing. They had become experts in missing children investigations, advocates for legislative reform, and reluctant public figures in the missing children community. They had also become different people than they had been in 2009. The young parents who had taken their 8-year-old daughter to a county fair had evolved into middle-aged adults who understood the criminal justice system, victim advocacy, and trauma psychology in ways they never could have anticipated. "Sometimes I wonder who we would have been if Emma had never disappeared," Margaret confided to David one evening in November 2023. "Would we have been happy? Would we have had more children? Would we have lived completely different lives?" "We probably would have been ordinary people living ordinary lives," David replied. "Maybe that would have been better. But this is who we are now, and maybe the people we've become will be better equipped to help Emma when she comes home." The phrase "when she comes home" still carried the same weight it always had, even after 14 years of uncertainty. Neither Margaret nor David had given up hope, though the nature of their hope had evolved over time. They no longer expected Emma to walk through their front door as the 8-year-old who had disappeared at the county fair. They understood that she would be a 23-year-old woman with her own experiences, memories, and possibly trauma to process. But they still believed that someday, somehow, they would see their daughter again. None of them could have predicted that the reunion would begin with a Billboard advertisement in New York City, or that it would raise more questions than it answered about what had happened to Emma Chen on that September night in 2009. March 15, 2024, started as an ordinary Friday for Margaret and David Chen. Margaret was working her regular shift at the Cedar Falls Public Library, helping patrons find research materials and organizing the children's section for the weekend reading program. David was in Des Moines, attending a conference on missing children legislation, something that had become a regular part of his advocacy work. Neither of them had planned to be in New York City that day. The trip happened because of a last-minute invitation that David received during the conference. "Margaret," David had called her that afternoon from Des Moines, his voice carrying an excitement she hadn't heard in years. "You're not going to believe this. Senator Richardson's office just called. They want me to testify before a congressional subcommittee next week about the Missing Children's Act amendments we've been pushing for." Margaret felt her heart skip a beat. David's advocacy work had been gaining national attention, but a congressional hearing was beyond anything they had imagined possible. "That's incredible," she said, setting down the book she had been cataloguing. "When and where?" "Wednesday in Washington, D.C., David replied. "But here's the thing. Senator Richardson's aide suggested I meet with some other advocacy groups in New York first to coordinate our testimony. There's a conference this weekend that I could attend, if I can get there by tomorrow." Margaret didn't hesitate. "Go," she said immediately. "This is exactly the kind of opportunity Emma would want us to pursue. This could help so many families." "Would you come with me?" David asked. "I know it's short notice, but I could really use your support. And honestly, I think you need a break from the routine here." Margaret looked around the quiet library, considered her weekend plans of cleaning house and tending to her garden, and realized that David was right. She had been in a rut, following the same patterns week after week, and maybe a change of scenery would be good for both of them. "Let me see if I can get someone to cover my Saturday shift," she said. "If I can arrange that, yes, I'll come with you." By Friday evening, Margaret and David were on a flight from Cedar Rapids to New York's LaGuardia Airport. Margaret hadn't been to New York City since college, and David had only visited once for a brief advocacy meeting several years earlier. As their plane descended through the evening darkness toward the glittering cityscape below, Margaret felt something she hadn't experienced in years, anticipation that wasn't related to Emma's case. They checked into a modest hotel in Midtown Manhattan, planning to spend Saturday morning exploring the city before David's conference activities began that afternoon. Margaret had researched some museums and landmarks she wanted to visit, and for the first time in 15 years, she was thinking about something other than missing children and police investigations. Saturday morning dawned clear and cold, with that crisp March air that makes walking around New York City particularly invigorating. Margaret and David bundled up and set out from their hotel, planning to walk through Times Square, visit Central Park, and maybe see the 9/11 memorial if time permitted. Times Square was as overwhelming as Margaret had expected, a sensory explosion of lights, sounds, people, and activity that seemed to pulse with its own energy. Street performers competed with traffic noise. Tourists snapped photos of everything in sight, and massive digital billboards advertised everything from Broadway shows to luxury watches. "I forgot how intense this place is," David said, raising his voice to be heard over the din of the city. "It's like sensory overload." Margaret was actually enjoying the chaos. After years of quiet routines in Cedar Falls, the energy and anonymity of New York felt liberating. Nobody here knew her story or looked at her with the mixture of sympathy and curiosity she had grown accustomed to at home. They were walking north on Broadway, approaching the intersection with 47th Street, when Margaret stopped so suddenly that David bumped into her from behind. "Honey, what's wrong?" he asked, following her gaze upward toward the massive billboards that dominated the intersection. Margaret couldn't speak. She was staring at a billboard approximately 60 feet above the street, advertising what appeared to be a high-end fashion brand called Luminous. The billboard featured a striking young woman with long, dark hair, wearing an elegant white dress and smiling confidently at the camera. The woman looked exactly like Emma would look now, at 23 years old. "David," Margaret whispered, her voice barely audible over the street noise. "David, look at that billboard." David followed her gaze and felt his knees nearly buckle. The resemblance was unmistakable. The facial structure, the eyes, even the way the model held her head was achingly familiar. It was like seeing one of the age progression images come to life, but more vivid and realistic than any computer-generated rendering could ever be. "Oh my God," David said, his voice thick with emotion. "Margaret, is that—" "I don't know," Margaret replied, though every instinct in her body was screaming that yes, this was Emma. "But we have to find out." They stood on the busy sidewalk for several minutes, oblivious to the crowds of people flowing around them, staring up at the billboard that seemed to have materialized from their deepest hopes and fears. Margaret pulled out her phone and took dozens of photographs, zooming in on the model's face, capturing every detail she could from their position on the street. "The butterfly necklace," Margaret said suddenly, her voice sharp with excitement. David squinted up at the billboard. "What butterfly necklace?" "Look closer," Margaret insisted. "Around her neck. It's small, but there's definitely a necklace, and it looks like it could be a butterfly pendant." David strained to see the detail Margaret was pointing out. The billboard was high above them, and the necklace was a small detail in the overall advertisement. But Margaret was right. There appeared to be a delicate chain around the model's neck with some kind of pendant. It could have been Emma's butterfly necklace, the one her grandmother had given her for her 8th birthday, the one she had been wearing the night she disappeared from the county fair. "We need to contact Detective Rodriguez immediately," David said, pulling out his own phone. "And we need to find out everything we can about this advertisement, who the model is, what agency represented her, when this was photographed." Margaret was already walking toward the base of the billboard, looking for any identifying information about the advertising company or contact details. The billboard was mounted on a building that appeared to house retail shops and offices, but she couldn't immediately see any signs indicating who was responsible for the outdoor advertising. David called Detective Rodriguez, but the call went to voicemail. He left an urgent message explaining where they were and what they had discovered, and asking the detective to call back as soon as possible. "We need to think about this systematically," Margaret said, her librarian training kicking in despite her emotional turmoil. "We need to document everything we can observe, get contact information for the advertising company, and try to identify the model through the fashion brand." They spent the next hour walking around the immediate area, photographing the billboard from multiple angles, and trying to find any contact information related to the outdoor advertising. David used his smartphone to research the luminous fashion brand, while Margaret approached several shop owners in the building below the billboard to ask about the advertising company. The research revealed that Luminous was a relatively new luxury fashion brand based in New York, with a website that featured the same model from the billboard in several different advertisements. The model was identified only as Sophia in the website's photo credits, with no last name or biographical information provided. "This has to be professional modeling," David observed, scrolling through the Luminous website on his phone. "These aren't amateur photographs. Whoever this woman is, she's represented by a legitimate modeling agency." Margaret had been more successful in her inquiries with the shop owners. A manager at a coffee shop on the ground floor of the building had given her the contact information for Apex Outdoor Advertising, the company responsible for the billboard displays in that location. "They update the billboards every few weeks," the manager had explained. "This particular one with the fashion model has been up for about a month, I think." By early afternoon, David had to leave for his conference activities, but Margaret remained in Times Square, continuing her investigation. She called Apex Outdoor Advertising and explained that she was trying to identify the model in the luminous advertisement for a family matter. "I'm sorry, ma'am," the customer service representative had said, "but we don't provide information about the content of our advertisements. You'd need to contact the advertiser directly." Margaret then called the luminous fashion brand, but their customer service department was similarly unhelpful. "For privacy reasons, we don't provide information about our models or photographers," she was told. "If you have a business inquiry, you can email our marketing department." Frustrated but not defeated, Margaret sent detailed emails to both companies explaining that she believed the model in the advertisement might be her missing daughter and requesting assistance in identifying her. She attached recent age progression photographs of Emma and provided contact information for Detective Rodriguez. That evening, David returned from his conference activities to find Margaret in their hotel room, surrounded by printed photographs of the billboard and pages of notes about her investigative efforts. "Any luck?" he asked, sitting down beside her on the hotel bed. "Limited success with official channels," Margaret replied, "but I've been thinking about other approaches. This is New York City. There are thousands of people in the fashion and modeling industry. Someone has to know who this woman is." Margaret had spent the afternoon researching modeling agencies in New York, identifying the major firms that represented fashion models for luxury brands like Luminous. She had also looked into photographers who specialized in fashion advertising, thinking that identifying the photographer might lead them to the model. "I think our best bet is to approach this from multiple angles," she continued. "Contact modeling agencies directly, find fashion industry contacts who might recognize her, maybe even hire a private investigator who specializes in the entertainment industry." David nodded, impressed by Margaret's methodical approach. "What about social media? If she's a professional model, she probably has an Instagram account or other online presence." This was an avenue Margaret hadn't fully explored yet. They spent the rest of the evening scrolling through social media, searching for the name Sophia, in combination with terms like model, fashion, New York, and luminous. The search yielded hundreds of results, but none that clearly matched the woman from the billboard. Sunday morning brought unexpected developments. Margaret's phone rang at 7:30 a.m. with a call from Detective Rodriguez, who had received David's voicemail and Margaret's follow-up emails. "I have to tell you," Detective Rodriguez said, "I'm skeptical that this is Emma. You've both been hoping for a breakthrough for 15 years, and it's natural to see resemblances that might not actually be there." Margaret understood the detective's caution, but she was convinced that this warranted serious investigation. "Detective, I know how this sounds, but the resemblance is extraordinary. And the necklace. I'm almost certain she's wearing Emma's butterfly necklace." "All right," Detective Rodriguez said. "Send me all the photographs and information you've gathered, and I'll see what I can do from here. I have some contacts in New York law enforcement who might be able to help with the investigation." Margaret immediately sent all of her documentation to Detective Rodriguez, then called Marcus Thompson, the private investigator who had worked on Emma's case previously. Marcus was intrigued by the development and agreed to travel to New York to assist with the investigation. "If this is really Emma," Marcus said, "we need to be extremely careful about how we approach the situation. If she's been held against her will for 15 years, confronting her directly could be dangerous for everyone involved." By Monday morning, Margaret and David had extended their stay in New York and assembled a small team of people working to identify the model from the billboard. Detective Rodriguez was coordinating with New York police, Marcus Thompson was using his private investigation resources, and Margaret was continuing her systematic outreach to fashion industry contacts. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Margaret had posted photographs of the billboard in several online groups dedicated to finding missing persons, hoping that someone might recognize the model or have information about the Luminous advertising campaign. A woman named Janet Morrison responded to one of Margaret's posts with information that made Margaret's heart race. Janet worked as a casting director for advertising agencies in New York, and she recognized the model from the billboard. "Her name is Sophia Chen," Janet wrote in her message. "She's represented by Elite Model Management, and she's been working in New York for about 3 years. I cast her for a cosmetics commercial last year. She's very professional and talented, but there's something sad about her, like she's carrying some kind of burden." Margaret stared at the message in disbelief. The last name was Chen, the same as their family name. It could have been a coincidence, since Chen was a common surname, but combined with the physical resemblance and the apparent age of the model, it seemed too significant to ignore. Margaret immediately forwarded Janet's information to Detective Rodriguez and Marcus Thompson, then called Elite Model Management to inquire about Sophia Chen. The agency was professional but protective of their client's privacy, agreeing only to pass along a message requesting that Sophia contact Margaret about a family matter. The waiting was agonizing. Margaret and David remained in New York, afraid to leave in case Sophia responded to their message. They had no way of knowing if Sophia would even receive the message or if she would choose to respond if she did. Tuesday evening, Margaret's phone rang with a call from an unknown New York number. "Hello," said a voice that Margaret had been dreaming of hearing for 15 years. "This is Sophia Chen. I received a message that someone named Margaret Chen wanted to speak with me about a family matter." Margaret's hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold the phone. "Sophia," she said, her voice breaking, "this is going to sound impossible, but I think you might be my daughter Emma, who disappeared 15 years ago." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. "I think you might be right," Sophia said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've been looking for you my whole life." The reunion took place the next day in a quiet coffee shop in Greenwich Village, chosen because it was private enough for an emotional conversation but public enough to feel safe. Margaret and David arrived 30 minutes early, both of them trembling with anticipation and terror. When Sophia walked into the coffee shop, there was no doubt in either of their minds that this was Emma. 15 years older, sophisticated and elegant in the way that New York models learn to be, but unmistakably their daughter. She was wearing the butterfly necklace. The first few minutes were awkward, with all three of them crying and struggling to find words adequate for the moment. But gradually, the conversation began to flow, and the story of the past 15 years began to emerge. Sophia, who had been told her name was Sophia Martinez, had been raised by a woman named Elena Martinez in New York City. Elena had told Sophia that she was her aunt and that Sophia's parents had died in a car accident when she was young. Elena had provided a loving home, but Sophia had always felt like something was missing from her story. "I never felt like I looked like Elena," Sophia explained, "and I didn't remember anything about my parents or the car accident she described. When I got older, I started asking questions, but Elena would get upset and change the subject." Elena had encouraged Sophia's interest in modeling and had been supportive of her career, but she had always been vague about family history and had discouraged Sophia from trying to research her background. "About a year ago, I decided to do a DNA test," Sophia continued. "I thought it might help me find relatives, or at least understand my ethnic background better. But when the results came back, they didn't match what Elena had told me about our family. The DNA test had revealed that Sophia had relatives named Chen, not Martinez, and that her genetic background was inconsistent with Elena's story about their family history." Sophia had begun to suspect that Elena had lied to her about her origins, but she hadn't known how to pursue the truth. "When I saw your message yesterday," Sophia said, tears streaming down her face, "everything suddenly made sense. Elena isn't my aunt. She's the person who took me from you." The investigation that followed revealed the full scope of Elena Martinez's deception. Elena had been a carnival worker in 2009, though not with the company that provided rides for the Black Hawk County Fair. She had been visiting the fair as a customer, but she had been struggling with infertility and depression, and she had impulsively taken Emma during the confusion of the altercation near the game booths. Elena had driven directly to New York City with Emma, changed both of their names, and created false documents establishing herself as Sophia's guardian. She had genuinely loved and cared for Sophia over the years, but she had built their entire relationship on a foundation of lies and kidnapping. "I think she convinced herself that she was saving me," Sophia told her parents during one of their many conversations in the weeks following their reunion. "She gave me a good life, and she loved me, but she stole me from you." Elena Martinez was arrested and charged with kidnapping, child endangerment, and identity fraud. During her interrogation, she broke down and confessed to taking Emma from the county fair, explaining that she had been desperate for a child and had acted impulsively when she saw Emma alone by the Ferris wheel. "I watched her for a few minutes," Elena told investigators, "and when her parents walked away, I just took her hand and led her away. She was scared at first, but I told her I was taking her to find her mommy and daddy. By the time she realized what was happening, we were already in my car." Elena had driven through the night to New York, stopping only for gas and food. She had destroyed Emma's yellow sundress and changed her clothes, but she had allowed her to keep the butterfly necklace because Emma had cried so desperately when Elena tried to take it away. The reunion between Margaret, David, and their daughter was joyful but complex, exactly as the experts had predicted. Sophia had no clear memories of her life before age 8, and she had spent her entire conscious life believing that Elena was her family. Learning that her entire identity had been based on lies was traumatic, even as she was grateful to finally understand the truth about her origins. "I always felt like there was something missing," Sophia told her parents. "Now I understand what it was. It was you." The healing process would take years, but for the first time in 15 years, Margaret and David could sleep peacefully, knowing that their daughter was safe and that their family was finally beginning to be whole again. The billboard that had led to their reunion was taken down 2 weeks later, replaced by an advertisement for a Broadway show. But Margaret had dozens of photographs of it, and she kept one framed on her kitchen table, a reminder that sometimes the most extraordinary endings come from the most ordinary moments. Their daughter had come home just as they had always believed she would,